It's been moved, and Rory Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Beginning with the report of the House of Commons Defence Committee. And the key element in this report, and the key element indeed in what I'm going to say and what I hope will be relatively brief remarks, is that Russia does pose a very significant and substantial threat to Europe. That argument has been made in a great deal of detail by the Defence Committee, and in the months since that report was published, that has become increasingly evident. As we were working our way through the report, just to remind the House, we had a statement from the Foreign Secretary in the House saying that he had been assured by Lavrov that Russia would not invade Crimea, and 4 days later Russia invaded Crimea. We then heard a number of specialists and analysts say that Russia would not go into eastern Ukraine, and Russia then went into eastern Ukraine. We heard people say that after the Malaysian airliner was shot down, that would be the moment at which Russia would back off. They were embarrassed by what they'd done. Russia didn't back off. People then have been very clear that Russia would not extend to Mariupol or Odessa, but as we can see at the moment, separatists with Russian support are clearly moving towards Mariupol and Odessa. What does this mean in terms of the UK Ministry of Defence, NATO and defence spending? Well, in terms of the House of Commons Defence Committee report, we essentially focus on two things. One of them is the conventional threat posed by Russia, and the other is the threat which we describe as next-generation warfare, ambiguous warfare, or an asymmetric threat posed by Russia. And although these two things are related, it's worth analysing them separately. So to take the conventional threat posed by Russia first, the argument of this report is that Russia, through the exercise in 2013, the Zapad 2013 exercise, showed the ability to deploy almost 70,000 troops at 72 hours' notice. The current estimate within NATO is it would take nearly 6 months for NATO to deploy that number of troops. Russia displayed, of course, the ability to fly nuclear bombers to Venezuela, to exercise for a full amphibious assault on a Baltic state. It has upgraded its nuclear arsenal. It's committed to spending $100 billion a year on defense. And all of this is taking place in the context of a decline in NATO defense spending.
I thank the Chairman for giving way so early in his speech. One of the reasons that he's only had to consider two aspects, namely unconventional and conventional warfare, is that we have our strategic nuclear deterrent still in place, and if either the opposition or the Conservative Party have anything to do with it, that will remain the case. Does he not agree with me that it would be madness to think of disposing of our deterrent, of ending continuous at-sea deterrence? And isn't it strange that there doesn't appear to be a single, oh no, there is one single representative just appeared from the party, and I hope he disagrees with his own party in proposing that we should actually abandon continuous at-sea deterrence, namely the Liberal Democrat Party.
It's an invitation, of course, to go into exactly this theme, which is that essentially, in terms of responses to the Russian conventional threat, we have planned really for 20 years for fighting enemies in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. We've planned on the basis of these expeditionary warfare. The planning assumptions really at the base of Future Force 2020, or the SDSR, was really about being able to put 6,600 people into the field and maintain them there for enduring stability operations, or in the past 10,000. We hadn't really thought about taking on an enemy like Russia. In fact, if you were to look at the national security strategy, the threat of what we've seen done by Russia was marked down as a tier 3 or bottom level probability. And this means a lot of things. It has implications, of course, for nuclear weapons. It has implications for many capacities which we've got rid of in Britain over the last 20 years. So we used to exercise at scale. To be able to exercise in the mid-1980s 130, 140,000 people. Last year we were exercising at the scale of about 6,600 people at a time when Russia was exercising up in the 70,000 area. It meant that we got rid of our significant capacity in wide water crossing, that's engineering. It's meant a reduction in armour because we didn't expect to be fighting tank battles. But it's also meant, more relevantly to the question posed by the Honourable Member, it's meant that we need to think much more seriously, of course, about ballistic missile defence. It means that we need to think much, much more seriously about chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear. Yep.
I'm grateful to the Chairman for giving way, and I accept his committee's recommendation that as a minimum we have to spend 2% of GDP, but even at that level, how many of these missing capabilities could we actually put back into our own capability?
This is a very, very good question, which I hope I can get to towards the end of the speech. The assumption of spending 2% of GDP on defence, which of course is absolutely essential, because we organise an entire NATO summit around the idea of spending 2% of our GDP on defence, is of course the hope that as the economy grows, defence spending will grow and we can make the necessary 5-year planning which will return confidence to the armed forces and allow us to make some of these investments. But the question is a very good one. We would still have very significant constraints in relation to Trident, certainly in relationship to operating our aircraft carrier, and certainly if we wanted to make investments, significant investments in restoring armour capacity, even 2% of GDP would be pushing it. Yeah.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and I apologise for coming in late. But about 30 years ago, when Dennis Healy was Defence Secretary, when he looked down the road at the defence needs, he actually said that modern warfare for the future would rely more on conventional weapons than they would on nuclear weapons and that sort of thing. But the other point the Honourable Gentleman made, although we may not have planned for any war with Russia, I would imagine the United States had, because they certainly have played war games, for want of a better term, and look at various scenarios. What does he think about that? Does he know anything about that?
So you're absolutely right. We haven't been focused on Russia, and the United States certainly has more capacity. But it's striking that even the United States significantly reduced its capacity to deal with an adversary like Russia. There's been a lot of criticism within the entire Pentagon administration about the focus on counterinsurgency warfare. A man called Colonel Gentile ran a huge campaign to try to get the United States to focus more on conventional threats. We in Britain have got rid of a lot of our Russian analysis capacity. One of the things we've pointed out in the report is that we got rid of ARAG, which did the basic Russian analysis. We sacked our Ukraine desk officer. DIS reduced its Russian analysis. The same has been happening in the United States. They're now building up very rapidly, but what you notice when you go to Supreme Allied Commander Europe and you look at the American capacity is that that Russian capacity is being built up from a very low base again, which is very troubling. I don't want to speak too long because I know there are many members to come in, so if I can just return to the basic framework of the argument, conventional, unconventional, and what we should be doing. So having laid out the conventional, what should we be doing from the point of view of Britain? Well, what we believe we should be doing is we should be looking to exercise at a larger level, so we should begin to return to some of the kinds of exercises we did in previous eras, which involve exercising at least at a divisional level. It's quite encouraging that NATO is beginning to look at an exercise at the level of 35,000 people. We'd like to see more of that. We'd like to see politicians and policymakers involved in that. We'd like to see all-armed exercises. We're going to be looking very closely at Norway 2018, which seems to be a big opportunity to do this. We have to look very, very carefully at this very high readiness task force. So one of the things that the committee recommended was the setting up of a deployable force under the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, like ARC, which could go out and respond rapidly within 72 hours to a Russian threat. It was a very good sign at the Wales summit that that commitment was made, but the details need to be improved dramatically. The framework nations at the moment are struggling to provide 5,000 people, and they need to produce one brigade standing up, one currently in exercise, and one standing down. We haven't yet seen what's happening with the enablers. We need to see what's happening with whether they're going to be able to move forward with ISTAR. Are they going to have the cyber capacity connected? Here's another question perhaps for the Minister. France has committed as a framework nation. Are we certain that they're committing their troops uniquely to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, or are we in danger of a situation in which people are double-hatting? In other words, the French are retaining the ability to deploy their brigade to Africa when it suits them, and this very high readiness task force will then be a second-order call. But it is in asymmetric warfare that we need to focus most of all. Because although Russian tanks crossing the border into Estonia would be a very high impact event. It is at the moment, we estimate, a low probability event. Not one that we should ignore, because of course, were Putin to do it, we really wouldn't know what to do. I mean, were Putin actually to roll tanks across and take over even a mile or two of Estonia, NATO would be in a very, very serious problem. As the Swedish General Naretniks has pointed out, it would be very difficult. It would require very considerable political will to get Russia out of that situation. But the most likely move, that I'm going to come to Geezer and then to Mike Gibbs second, the most likely move is asymmetric warfare. First, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, just on that point of capacity, it's interesting to note that in 1989 there were 5,000 US battle tanks stationed in Europe. It's now down to 29. The capacity is not there, even if you just look what the Americans are providing, never mind our failure to provide.
So this is a very, very significant point. It is true, of course, that ultimately the theoretical NATO capacity dwarfs the capacity of Russia. But a lot of this stuff is extremely difficult to deploy. These nations, many nations, are very, very reluctant to pay the money required to exercise. A lot of this money is absorbed in pension schemes. And you can see that basically our problem is that we're defending this enormous multi-thousand-mile border in which Russia can, I'm going to come in a second, but in which Russia can potentially, should it wish, cause trouble all the way from the Baltic, all the way around to the Caucasus. And we have to deal with that entire area, which may be very difficult to do, even with the 3.3 million troops that we currently have in NATO.
He referred to Estonia. And clearly, under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, all the other 27 member states would have an obligation to respond to an armed attack on Estonia. But there is a level of ambiguity given the hybrid warfare that the Russians are engaged in, have been engaged in, cyber attacks and others. And given that Putin doesn't necessarily wish to invoke a major military conflict, how do we deal as NATO with those hybrid attacks?
Thank you. Well, the hybrid attacks are exactly what I was getting onto, the asymmetric attacks, next generation warfare attacks. So, as the Labour Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee has just pointed out, the conventional attack is a low probability, high impact event. Much more probable is this kind of asymmetric hybrid warfare. In other words, what one is more likely to find is cyber attacks the kind we saw in Estonia in 2007. More likely to find is separatists popping up, claiming that they're being abused or minority rights are being abused in a place like Nerva in eastern Estonia. We saw 45% of the Russian population of Latvia in a survey at the time of the occupation of Crimea supported the Russian occupation of Crimea. So what are we supposed to do? Well, the answer is it's really difficult. And we absolutely need to raise our game in three areas before I come for the Honourable Member from Barrow. Three areas, and those areas, as you've indicated, are cyber, information warfare, and these special forces operations. Honourable Member for Barrow.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. I just want to remind him of the recent report on deterrence that the committee completed just before he assumed the chair, which made clear that in the event of some sort of cyber attack, that actually we must be prepared to say to a potential adversary like Russia, we will not necessarily wait for 100% proof and would be prepared to enact countermeasures even when they even despite the fact they have tried to create some uncertainty and ambiguity over the exact emanation of such an attack.
So, Honourable Barrow raises absolutely this right point about cyber. Now, the reason cyber is crucial is that very few of us in this House, certainly myself, understand cyber in detail. We're taking on faith that we're developing a significant cyber capacity. It is extremely difficult for us to be confident of what we're doing in cyber, and there are two particular questions in cyber which it would be great if the Minister could address. One of them is NATO cyber capacity. The members of the committee went to visit the cyber centre in Estonia, where we discovered at the time that there were only 2 UK personnel posted to that cyber centre. It was very difficult to be confident what deterrent effect that kind of cyber would involve. And it also raises, in the second question, the question around doctrine. Are we prepared to look at threatening a cyber response as part of the deterrence to prevent a Russian cyber attack? Are we prepared, in other words, to say that were Russia to mount a cyber attack against a NATO member state, that we would respond with a cyber attack in kind?
I'm grateful to my friend for giving way, and I agree with everything that he's been saying, and in particular the importance that he attaches to cyber. And he will remember that in the SDSR 2010, one of the Secretary of State's then up arrows, i.e. areas where we need to invest, was in cyber security, where we set aside £650 million over 4 years. And part of that, of course, was cyber attack.
And this is very, very important. I think the thing that's difficult for us as a committee to deal with, given that often when we look at cyber, we're told that a lot of this is the job of the Intelligence and Security Committee, is just how good that is. Clearly the government's committed a lot of money to it, but at the same time, many members of the House come to us having spoken to members of the Ministry of Defence who are very concerned about our cyber capacity and are not confident that we've really got where we want to be or that we fully understand what this technology is. The second thing is around information operations. Now, it is very, very clear that the basic problem for Russian minorities in the Baltic is the fact that they watch Moscow television, and that we need to ensure that we have the ability to project television into the Baltic states in the Russian language, which is entertaining, which is engaging, which the minorities in those areas are prepared to watch, and which counters propaganda, not with propaganda, but with the truth, that is prepared to have an objective, truthful, honest conversation about what's going on in the world, and above all, that is actually able to draw attention to the kind of things that Putin is doing. So this means centrally that we need to invest in the BBC World Service. And again, we spend a lot of time talking about this, a lot of time talking about Russian language television. The reality is we are yet to see the evidence from this government or from the United States that the real investment is being made to create a genuinely watchable, attractive Russian language service which could be watched by Russian minorities around the edge of NATO. The final and most difficult thing is, of course, dealing with this issue around special forces, insurgents, little green men, and exactly the kinds of incidents that we saw in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. The reason that that's the most difficult of all is that this is a challenge for us in the Ministry of Defence, but also for the Foreign Office and for the intelligence agencies, because it's a challenge of understanding. If Putin does something, the first thing is a question of interpretation or understanding. He will operate under the threshold. He's deliberately, as the Labour chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee has pointed out, not going to do something which will cross the Article 5 threshold initially. This means that when we see something, to take a couple of examples just to illustrate these threats, if, for example, the Polish electricity infrastructure were to go down, there might be an immediate claim that it had been taken down by a Russian cyber attack. We would need very rapidly to be in a position in Britain to be able to know whether in fact it had been taken down by a Russian cyber attack and then determine how to respond. In order to do that, we would need to have what we currently do not have, which is to say, the people on the ground in Poland with the necessary relationship with the Polish electricity minister in order to actually get to the bottom of that very quickly and get the information through to us. We lack, at every level, from the strategic political level, which is analysing Putin, all the way down to the ISTAR level of actually watching Russian kit moving around. We lack intelligence and information.
I notice my honourable friend, and quite rightly so, is focusing on the threat, the clear and present threat of Russia at the moment. But when looking at asymmetrical war, we should also be looking at the threats that are coming from the Middle East now and dealing with the challenges of that and how we deal with those challenges. There are the cyber threats that continue to come from China and North Korea. So it's not just the Russian threat at the moment we need to be cognizant of. It is other areas of the world which are a direct threat to the UK.
Perhaps that provides a good way for me to drive towards a conclusion, which is to say that, as the honourable member has just pointed out, the kind of threats which Russia or Putin can bring are going to be very, very unpredictable. I am going to be humiliated by what Putin does over the next 5-10 years. It's going to be very difficult to guess what he's going to do next. What's clear about Putin is that he has been thinking very hard since at least 2008 about how to unsettle or unbalance NATO. He's going to be pulling levers and pushing buttons which we cannot yet anticipate. So we will see him, I would imagine, be tempted to do things in relation to Iran. So we could expect Putin, for example, to do something in relation to the Iranian nuclear negotiations. We've seen already in Syria, and this is something dear to the honourable member's heart, we've seen already in Syria his very direct contribution to the civil war in Syria through the protection of Bashar al-Assad. We can see his control over the gas supplies on Bulgaria. It's not very difficult for us to imagine how you could cause trouble in Nerva. Not very difficult to imagine how you could put a few Spetsnaz troops into a forest somewhere in Latvia and just sit them there and wait to see what we do. If you are going to be dealing with threats along that arc, you need to very much change the kinds of ways that we think in Britain in our Ministry of Defence. We cannot rest in the comfortable world we've been in for the last 20 years of imagining we're going to have a neat deployment of 6,600 soldiers on an expeditionary warfare campaign. They're going to stay there for 5 to 10 years doing stabilization operations. They're going to come home. We're going to have to respond to very nuanced, ambiguous, unpredictable attacks all the way around an arc between the Baltic and potentially Iran. And in order to do that, we need to invest very, very heavily in Russian language expertise, in defense engagement, in defense attaches in all those countries. To give one example, the United States currently has 3 defense attaches in each Baltic state. We have 1 defense attaché covering 3 Baltic states. That simply isn't enough. If we were to ask our Ministry of Defense, are the defenses in Mariupol adequate to deal with the Russian advance? We can't answer that question because the defense attaché currently in Kiev is not permitted to travel up to the front line. We need to invest then in DIS, in the Foreign Office, and to do this, and this is what I'm going to conclude on, we must make this investment of 2% of GDP in defence. We need to make this for many, many different reasons. I'm going to give way to the honourable member and then I'm going to come to the conclusion.
I'm grateful to the chairman of the Select Committee to give way because I don't want him to ignore another part of the world before he finishes, because all the countries he's mentioned, at least we can be part of the NATO family. But what about the Falklands? The chairman will be aware that Argentina has not given up, but who's going to support us down in the South Atlantic?
Well, this is a very significant question, and it's one definitely worth thinking about. Definitely worth thinking about in the next SDSR, because of course, as the honourable member is pointing out in his question, a lot of our assumptions are based on the fact that we will operate with a US coalition, and certainly in relation to something such as the Falklands, we cannot be so confident that that would happen.
I'm very grateful as Chairman of the Defence Select Committee. 2% is just a number that has been dragged out of the air. It happens to be the level of our defence expenditure at about 2.07% of GDP. The conclusions of the summit in Wales seemed remarkably similar to the British posture, which I suppose, as to what NATO's targets ought to be. The fact is, the nature of Russia has undergone a disappointing divergence from that everyone would have hoped for post the end of the Soviet Union. That is now beyond contradiction. And we are back to the grounds where we should be where we were in 1977. We should now have to, regrettably, prepare for conflict. And 2% doesn't cut it.
Very, very supportive of that. Very, very, very supportive of the idea that we should be spending even more.
And so am I, if I might say to my honourable friend who's making an excellent analysis of the situation. But I understood that at the NATO summit, Britain was in the forefront of demanding that all NATO countries produce 2% of GDP for defence spending. So may I say that I absolutely support the Prime Minister in this, that we want to have 2% of GDP, although personally I'd rather go farther and have more.
Rory Stewart.
So to come to the conclusion, the 4 reasons why we need 2%. The first reason is absolutely just been pointed out by the former Defence Minister, my right honourable friend, who has just pointed out, from a point of view of UK credibility, the UK led that push for 2% at the Wales summit only 6 months ago. We stood alongside the United States and we went round every other country at that summit saying, if you're going to be serious, you have to commit 2%, and emphasizing again and again that we were spending 2% of our GDP on defense and they should spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And that was a very, very important thing in getting a range of countries to commit to spend 2% of the GDP on defense over the next 5 to 10 years. So the first reason why we must do it is simply out of a sense of shame, our honor and our credibility as the United Kingdom is bound up.
Can I also affirm that the chairman of the Select Committee making a fantastic analysis of the whole situation. Can I add my concerns that 2% simply isn't enough for the commitments that we inevitably will have and our forebears have fought and died for freedom and democracy. And can I add that what concerns me even more is that some people, it seems, don't seem to appreciate that to get ships and aircraft carriers and groups and battalions reformed, retrained, this takes years. And once they've gone and we're called to action, we simply will not have the manpower to deal with it.
Rory Stewart.
This is the second point that I was coming to. The second reason why we have to spend 2% of GDP on defense or more is that we actually have some very concrete tasks that we need to perform, some real requirements if we're to deal with a new threat. The problem with the threat assessments since the end of the Cold War is they've been threat assessments done in a vacuum. Now that we actually can see a threat in the form of Putin, we realize that there are very considerable capacities that we need to rebuild, and those capacities cost money. We need to invest in them. The third reason to do this is that deterrence is about psychology. Deterrence is about willpower. It's about confidence. It's not just about kit. That 2% is about what Putin thinks of us. It's about whether he thinks we're serious. Now, very often we think that the way to deal with a Russian conventional threat is with a conventional response, and a Russian unconventional threat is with an unconventional response. But of course, Russia, particularly Gerasimov, their chief of staff, uses this phrase asymmetric warfare, which means the Russians understand very well that often you deal with a conventional threat with an unconventional response and vice versa. It is the case that one of the best ways of deterring Putin from mucking around either conventionally or unconventionally is to see the confidence of that NATO commitment towards 2% of GDP. As he begins to see these exercises, as he begins to see the spending, as he begins to see the increasing confidence of our armed forces, that acts as a deterrent. And that it is that brings me to my last argument for why 2% of GDP on defense is absolutely central, which is that it provides a fantastic framework of planning for our armed forces for the next 5 years. The fundamental problem in defense and foreign affairs is, of course, the electoral cycles and the financial cuts of modern democracies, which simply do not operate in sync with the realities of the world and its crises.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. But isn't it also the case that the rigour of the SDSR process needs to do justice to the nature of the threats we face? Right. This isn't an argument about 2% or bust. It's about assessing the world as it exists today and will exist, and getting that assessment right and making sure we've got capabilities to meet the threats that will exist over the next 10 years.
Well, this will be led, must be led, by the SDSR. The entire problem that we face starts from the fact the SDSR put the Russian threat, this kind of threat, down at tier 3. It is going to be impossible within the system to argue for more defense spending unless the Foreign Office, the agencies, are prepared to agree with our assessment that Putin represents a significant threat. Unless we can absolutely make that central to the entire debate in the House today, establishing that we really believe in this threat, that it's not a joke threat. This isn't some special pleading by the Ministry of Defense. This isn't some attempt to simply sneak resources in by the back door, but that what Putin has done since the moment he entered Crimea, in fact, probably since the moment he entered Georgia, is display the reality that in order to hold the order of Europe, in order to maintain NATO, in order to deter future Russian expansion, we must have the credibility, the capacity, and the confidence. So to come back to that final point, that 2% allows us to step away from the political debates. It allows us to say to the armed services, your budget is protected. You can now plan over the next 5 years on the assumption that your budget will rise in real terms. That if the economy rises by 3%, your budget will increase by £1 billion a year. And you will be able to use that money to make the investments we need, whether they are in cyber, or in ballistic missile defense, or in CBRN, or, as I've been trying to argue, in the massive panoply of intelligence, defense engagement, assessment, which actually allows us to work out what is happening in the world. And it is that which will draw a new generation of soldiers and officers into the armed forces. They will be able to see that confidence, but above all, it will be Russia and our adversaries who will see that confidence, who will see that at a time when the world is becoming increasingly dangerous and unstable, our commitment to collective security is generous, clear, and long-term.
Yeah, very good.